In 1941, when German forces surrounded Moscow, 28 Soviet soldiers faced down 50 German tanks with nothing but rifles and Molotov cocktails. The odds were impossible, but what these men did next would inspire a nation and help turn the tide of World War II. Throughout history, there are moments when a handful of soldiers, vastly outnumbered and outgunned, made the ultimate choice to stand their ground against overwhelming odds. These aren't just tales of courage, they're pivotal moments that changed the course of history. From ancient Greece to the frozen forests of World War II, here are 5 heroic last stands that altered the fate of nations. November 16, 1941. The temperature had plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius as German tanks rolled toward Moscow. Hitler's Operation Typhoon was in full swing, and the Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. The German war machine had already conquered most of Europe, and now its sights were set on the Soviet capital. But at the Dubosekovo crossing, they encountered something unexpected. A small group of Soviet soldiers who would become legends. The situation in Moscow was desperate. German forces had advanced over 1,000 kilometers into Soviet territory in just a few months. Cities had fallen like dominoes, millions of Soviet soldiers had been captured, and now the Nazi war machine was just 90 kilometers from the capital. Stalin had refused to leave the city, but Moscow's factories were being dismantled and evacuated eastward. The fate of the Soviet Union hung by a thread. Political officer Vasily Klotchkov gathered his 28 men from the 316th Rifle Division. They were a diverse group: Russians, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and Ukrainians, ranging in age from 19 to 42 years old. Most were reservists and former collective farm workers, not professional soldiers. Their orders were simple but seemingly impossible. Hold the line at all costs. As the first German tanks appeared through the morning mist, Klotchkov uttered words that would echo through Soviet history. Russia is vast, but there is nowhere to retreat. Moscow is behind us. The battle that followed defied all military logic. Armed with only anti-tank rifles, grenades, and Molotov cocktails, these 28 men faced a column of 50 German tanks and 2 battalions of infantry. The morning was eerily quiet as they dug their positions into the frozen ground, their shovels striking sparks from the rock-hard earth. They established 3 defense lines along the railway embankment, carefully positioning their few anti-tank rifles for maximum effect. When the first tanks came within range, they struck with devastating precision. 4 tanks erupted in flames, their ammunition cooking off in spectacular explosions that illuminated the snow-covered battlefield. The Germans, stunned by the resistance, regrouped and attacked again. This time they tried to outflank the Soviet position, but Klotchkov had anticipated this. He had positioned his men in a way that created interlocking fields of fire. There was no safe approach to their position. For 4 hours, these men held their position against wave after wave of German attacks. The battlefield became an apocalyptic scene of burning tanks and frozen corpses. The defenders used every trick they knew, letting tanks pass over their trenches before attacking from behind, using their few anti-tank rifles to hit weak points, and coordinating their Molotov cocktails for maximum effect. The Soviet soldiers would wait until the tanks were practically on top of them before attacking, making every shot count. The cold was as much an enemy as the Germans. Weapons froze, requiring constant maintenance to keep them functioning. The defenders had to keep moving to prevent frostbite, even as German machine gun fire kept them pinned down. Several men died not from German bullets, but from having their positions crushed by tanks, their bodies frozen to the ground and unable to move in time. Klotchkov led from the front, moving between positions to encourage his men and coordinate their defense. When one of his youngest soldiers showed signs of fear, Klotchkov put his hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "Death is not the end, comrade. Being forgotten is." He died, leading a desperate charge against German infantry, taking 3 enemy soldiers with him. The battle reached its crescendo in the early afternoon. The Germans, frustrated by their mounting losses, launched an all-out assault. Tanks and infantry advanced together under the cover of heavy artillery. The defenders' positions were gradually overrun, but they fought to the last man and last bullet. 18 German tanks were destroyed before the position was finally taken. The snow had turned black with soot and red with blood. Only 6 of the 28 defenders survived, but their sacrifice was not in vain. The delay they caused disrupted the entire German offensive timetable. More importantly, their story spread throughout the Soviet Union, becoming a symbol of resistance that inspired millions. The 28 men were all awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, and their stand became a rallying cry for the defense of Moscow. The final push to take Moscow failed. The German army, delayed by actions like these across the front, was caught in the brutal Russian winter. The Soviet counterattack would drive them back, marking Hitler's first major defeat of the war. The 316th Rifle Division was renamed the 8th Guards Rifle Division and awarded the Order of the Red Banner. Their commander, General Ivan Panfilov, had died in battle just days after the stand at Dubosekovo, and the 28 men became known as Panfilov's men in his honor. But this was far from the first time in history that a small group of determined soldiers changed the course of history. 2,000 years earlier, another group of warriors would make a stand that would become legend. 480 BCE, the largest army ever assembled was marching through Greece. King Xerxes of Persia commanded a force that ancient sources claimed numbered over 1 million men. To understand the magnitude of this invasion, consider that most Greek city-states could only field armies of a few thousand. The Persian force was like nothing the ancient world had ever seen, a vast sea of humanity that stretched beyond the horizon. Xerxes' army was as diverse as it was massive. Persian immortals in golden scale armor marched alongside Ethiopians with painted shields, Scythian horse archers, and Indian warriors with cotton armor and bamboo bows. Their supply train alone was larger than most armies, with thousands of camels and mules carrying provisions across the continent. Standing in their path was a narrow coastal pass called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, named for the sulfur springs that dotted the area. Here, King Leonidas of Sparta positioned his force of just 300 Spartans and about 7,000 allies. The pass was barely 50 feet wide at its narrowest point, hemmed in by steep cliffs on one side and the sea on the other. This was where Leonidas would make his stand. The Spartans were unlike any other warriors of their time. From age 7, they endured the agoge, a brutal training system that turned boys into the finest soldiers in Greece. Their entire society was built around warfare. They trained every day, lived in military barracks, and dedicated their lives to perfecting the art of combat. The 300 Spartans Leonidas chose were not young men. They were veteran warriors, all over the age of 30, all fathers of sons to carry on their lines. For 2 days, the Greeks held firm against repeated Persian attacks. The narrow pass became a killing ground. Persian troops were forced to advance in a narrow column, negating their vast numbers. The Greeks fought in a phalanx formation, an interlocked wall of bronze shields and bristling spears. The Spartans' superior training and equipment proved decisive. Their longer spears and heavier armor gave them a crucial advantage in the close quarters fighting. Xerxes watched in frustration as his troops were slaughtered. Even his elite immortals, the cream of Persian nobility, were cut down in waves. The dead began to pile up so high that Persian troops had to climb over their own fallen comrades to reach the Greek lines. The Persian king was said to have jumped from his throne 3 times in rage as he watched his army's futile attacks. But everything changed when a local Greek named Ephialtes revealed a mountain path that could outflank the Greek position. This goat track, winding through the mountains, would allow the Persians to attack the Greeks from behind. Learning of this betrayal, Leonidas made a fateful decision. He dismissed most of his allies, keeping only his 300 Spartans and about 700 Thespians who volunteered to remain. Their mission was no longer to stop the Persians. It was to buy time for Greece to prepare its defenses. On the 3rd day, the Spartans knew they were surrounded. According to legend, when one soldier remarked that the Persian arrows were so numerous they darkened the sky, a Spartan warrior named Deinechus replied, "Good, then we shall fight in the shade." They'd fought to the last man, taking thousands of Persians with them. Even when their spears broke, they fought with swords. When their swords broke, they'd fought with daggers. When those were lost, they'd fought with bare hands and teeth. The sacrifice of Thermopylae gave Athens precious time to evacuate its civilian population to the island of Salamis and prepare for naval combat. The delay forced Xerxes to keep his army and navy together, making them easier to supply and slower to advance. More importantly, it showed that the mighty Persian army could be resisted, inspiring other Greek cities to join the fight. The subsequent Greek victory at Salamis would save Western civilization in its cradle. Without the sacrifice at Thermopylae, Athens might have fallen before it could prepare its defenses. The golden age of Greek culture, which gave us democracy, philosophy, drama, and the foundations of Western thought, might never have happened. Thermopylae became a symbol of courage against overwhelming odds that still resonates today. The epitaph at the battlefield, attributed to the poet Simonides, read, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." These words would inspire generations of soldiers facing impossible odds. Yet 2 millennia later, Another small force would face similar odds, and their sacrifice would help birth a nation that would become one of the most powerful in history. February 23, 1836. The Mexican Army of Operations under General Antonio López de Santa Anna arrived at the outskirts of San Antonio. Through the morning fog, they could make out the walls of the small mission, the Alamo. Inside those crumbling walls, just 189 Texian defenders prepared for what would become the most famous last stand in American history. The Alamo wasn't built for war. Originally constructed as a Spanish mission in the 18th century, its walls were never designed to withstand a military assault. The compound sprawled over 3 acres, making it difficult to defend with such a small force. But the Texians had done their best to fortify it, mounting cannons at key points and strengthening walls where they could. The force was commanded by 26-year-old William B. Travis, a former teacher turned lawyer who had never led men in combat before. Among his men were Jim Bowie, already famous for his knife-fighting skills and frontier exploits, and Davy Crockett, the legendary frontiersman who had arrived just weeks earlier with a group of Tennessee volunteers. They faced over 1,800 Mexican troops, professional soldiers who had already crushed other Texas rebellions. Santa Anna's army was impressive and well-equipped. Mexican infantry carried British-made Brown Bess muskets, and their artillery park included modern Brahms cannons. Their officers were veterans of numerous campaigns, and many of their soldiers have fought against Spanish royalists in Mexico's War of Independence. By all military logic, the battle should have been over quickly. Travis understood the gravity of their situation. He sent desperate letters pleading for reinforcements. His final message, addressed to the people of Texas and all Americans in the world, became immortal. "I shall never surrender or retreat, victory or death." The letter made its way through Mexican lines and was published in newspapers across Texas. Only 32 men from Gonzales managed to slip through the Mexican lines to join the defenders. For 13 days, the Alamo held out against constant bombardment. The Mexican artillery pounded the walls with over 900 shells, gradually reducing parts of the fortress to rubble. But the Texian gunners proved more accurate, forcing Santa Anna's cannons to withdraw several times. Each night, the defenders repaired their fortifications under cover of darkness. They were buying time, hoping for reinforcements that would never arrive in sufficient numbers. The conditions inside the Alamo grew increasingly desperate. Water was scarce, as the defenders had not had time to stock adequate supplies before the siege. Many men were sick, including Jim Bowie, who was confined to a cot with what may have been typhoid fever. Yet morale remained high. Crockett would often play his fiddle to lift spirits, and the men's belief in their cause never wavered. The final assault came before dawn on March 6. Santa Anna chose this time deliberately. The pre-dawn darkness would prevent the Texian sharpshooters from picking off his men from long range. Mexican troops attacked from all 4 sides, using scaling ladders to climb the walls. The Texian artillery devastated the first waves with canister shot, turning their cannons into giant shotguns that cut down dozens of attackers. But the Mexican forces kept coming. The north wall was breached first, and Mexican soldiers poured into the compound. The fighting moved room to room, building to building. The defenders used pistols, knives, and rifle butts in desperate close combat. Travis fell early in the battle, shot through the head while directing the defense. Crockett and his men held the low barracks until they were overwhelmed. Bowie, too sick to stand, reportedly shot several Mexican soldiers from his cot before being bayoneted. Within 90 minutes, it was over. All the defenders were killed, though they took hundreds of Mexican soldiers with them. Santa Anna ordered the bodies burned, believing this would end the Texas Revolution. He was wrong. The brutal nature of the battle and the execution of survivors outraged Americans throughout the United States. "Remember the Alamo" became a battle cry that energized the Texas Revolution. Sam Houston used the time bought by the Alamo's defenders to build an army. Many of his recruits were inspired by the sacrifice at the Alamo to join the cause. 6 weeks later, this army would rout Santa Anna's forces at San Jacinto, securing Texas independence. The battle lasted just 18 minutes, but the Texan soldiers' cries of "Remember the Alamo" echoed across the battlefield. The Alamo became more than just a battle. It became a symbol of American courage and defiance against overwhelming odds. Its defenders entered American mythology, their names remembered when those of more successful generals were forgotten. Their sacrifice helped create not just an independent Texas, but eventually led to the expansion of the United States to the Pacific. But on the other side of the world, another small garrison would soon face even greater odds, in a battle that would test the limits of human courage and endurance. January 22, 1879. The British Army had just suffered its worst defeat against a technologically inferior foe at the Battle of Isandlwana. Over 1,300 British troops had been killed by a Zulu army in a matter of hours. As the sun set on that disastrous day, exhausted survivors brought terrible news to the small mission station at Rorke's Drift. 4,000 Zulu warriors were heading their way. The mission station was never meant to be a fortress. It consisted of just 2 buildings, a hospital and a storehouse, connected by a makeshift wall of mealie bags, sacks of corn. Inside were just 150 British troops, many of them sick or wounded. The commanders, Lieutenants John Chart and Gonville Bromhead, were young officers with no combat experience. Chart was actually a Royal Engineer at the post only to build a bridge. When news of the approaching Zulu army reached them, he found himself in command simply because he had been commissioned 3 months before Bromhead. They had mere hours to prepare their defenses, and retreat was not an option. They couldn't abandon their sick and wounded comrades in the hospital. The defenders worked frantically to fortify their position. They created walls from mealie bags and biscuit boxes, converting the mission buildings into a makeshift fortress. Every able-bodied man was armed, including cooks and medical orderlies. They distributed ammunition and positioned their single artillery piece, a 7-pounder gun that would prove useless in the close-quarter battle to come. The Zulu force was formidable. These weren't primitive tribesmen, but disciplined warriors from one of Africa's most sophisticated military societies. The Zulu army had already demolished a much larger British force at Isandlwana using complex tactical maneuvers. Their standard attack formation, called the Horns of the Buffalo, had overwhelmed British troops who underestimated their capabilities. The attack began at 4:30 p.m. The first Zulu charge was like nothing the British had ever seen. Hundreds of warriors in full war regalia, their shields and spears gleaming in the late afternoon sun, charged the British positions while singing war songs that made the ground tremble. Wave after wave of warriors charged the British positions. The defenders' discipline was remarkable. They maintained controlled volleys of rifle fire, cutting down hundreds of attacking Zulus. But the Zulus kept coming. As night fell, the battle entered its most desperate phase. The Zulus set fire to the hospital's thatched roof, forcing the British to evacuate their wounded under heavy attack. Private Henry Hook and others performed incredible acts of heroism, breaking through walls with axes to rescue patients while fighting off Zulu warriors in room-to-room combat. The perimeter shrank as the defenders fell back, but they never broke. The fighting was constant and brutal. The British fought with bayonets when ammunition ran low. Every man who could hold a rifle fought, including the patients. The Zulus showed incredible bravery, repeatedly charging into devastating rifle fire, sometimes reaching the barricades before being driven back with bayonets. Through the night, the battle raged. The British position was illuminated by the burning hospital, making them perfect targets for Zulu marksmen who had captured British rifles at Isandlwana. The defenders had to move constantly to avoid being picked off. The air was thick with smoke, and the noise was deafening. The crack of rifles, the screams of the wounded, and the constant Zulu war chants. By dawn, the Zulus withdrew, leaving nearly 500 dead around the mission station. The British had lost only 17 men. The field around the station was carpeted with bodies, a testament to both Zulu courage and British firepower. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found the survivors still at their posts, many having fought for nearly 12 hours straight without rest. 11 Victoria Crosses, Britain's highest military honour, were awarded for this action, the most ever for a single battle. The stand at Rorke's Drift restored British prestige after the disaster of Isandlwana and had major political ramifications. It prevented a withdrawal from NATO and maintained British influence in southern Africa. More importantly, it changed attitudes on both sides. The British gained a newfound respect for Zulu military prowess, while the Zulus reconsidered the cost of confronting British firepower. The battle became a legend in British military history, celebrated in films and books, though often at the expense of recognizing Zulu bravery and tactical sophistication. But our final story takes us back to World War II, where another small force would make a stand that would help defeat Hitler's last desperate gamble. December 1944, Hitler launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge. The German advance caught the Allies completely off guard, punching through American lines with speed reminiscent of the 1940 Blitzkrieg. The German advance surrounded the Belgian town of Bastogne, a crucial road junction held by the 101st Airborne Division and elements of other units, about 11,000 men in total. The situation seemed tailor-made for disaster. The Americans were lacking in cold weather gear, medical supplies, and ammunition. Many were still exhausted from fighting in Operation Market Garden months earlier. They faced over 45,000 German troops supported by heavy armor, including the elite 2nd Panzer Division. The weather was atrocious. Heavy snow and dense fog prevented air support or resupply. Temperatures plunged to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne, organized his defense in a perimeter around the town. The Americans dug into the frozen ground, creating a series of strongpoints covering all approaches to Baston. When the German commander, General Heinrich von Lotwitz, demanded surrender, McAuliffe's reply was legendarily brief. Nuts! The Americans would hold their ground. For a week, the 101st Airborne repelled attack after attack. The Germans could not believe such a small force was holding them back. Tank attacks were broken up by infantry with bazookas, often at point-blank range. Artillery strikes were met with counter-battery fire from the Americans, dwindling ammunition supplies. Every German assault was thrown back with heavy losses. The conditions were as deadly as the enemy. The cold caused weapons to jam and vehicles to freeze. Frostbite became as common as combat wounds. Medical supplies ran so low that American doctors performed surgeries by flashlight, without anesthetics. The defenders took to burning furniture from Baston's houses just to stay warm. But the Americans showed remarkable ingenuity and determination. They recovered ammunition and weapons from disabled German tanks. Mechanics worked miracles keeping vehicles running in the extreme cold. Engineers created obstacles from frozen corpses and destroyed vehicles. When food ran low, they shared their meager rations with Baston's civilian population. The defense was aided by the town's layout. Baston sat on high ground, with roads radiating out like spokes on a wheel. This allowed the Americans to shift forces quickly to meet threats. They also benefited from German caution. The Wehrmacht, remembering brutal urban fighting on the Eastern Front, was reluctant to launch a full-scale assault on the town. On December 23, the skies briefly cleared. C-47 transport planes dropped vital supplies, including ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The sight of American planes boosted morale enormously. The Germans responded with their heaviest attack yet, determined to take the town before more supplies could arrive. The battle reached its crescendo on Christmas Day. The Germans launched a massive assault supported by artillery and heavy tanks. The Americans fought back with everything they had. Private Norman Dyke earned the Medal of Honor for taking out 3 German tanks with a bazooka. In another sector, Lieutenant John Hanlon led his men in hand-to-hand combat against German infantry in the ruins of a Belgian farm. On December 26, elements of Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve Baston. The sight of Sherman tanks approaching from the south was met with wild cheers from the defenders. The German offensive had been stopped cold, and Hitler's last gamble in the West had failed. The defense of Baston became a symbol of American determination and fighting spirit. The 101st Airborne earned the nickname Battered Bastards of Baston and was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation, the first entire division to receive this honor. Their stand prevented the German breakthrough from succeeding and helped turn the Battle of the Bulge from a potential disaster into a decisive American victory. These 5 last stands remind us that sometimes the most pivotal moments in history don't belong to the largest armies or the best equipped forces. They belong to those few brave souls who, when faced with overwhelming odds, choose to stand their ground. From the frozen plains of Russia to the streets of San Antonio, from ancient Greece to the forests of Belgium, these warriors prove that determination and courage can overcome seemingly impossible odds. Their sacrifices change the course of battles, wars, and ultimately, history itself. They remind us that in our darkest moments, when defeat seems certain, extraordinary courage can change the course of history. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories like these.